Hello everyone, and welcome back to another GIS lecture video. And in this lecture video, we're going to continue our discussion on the different types of spatial analysis basics by talking about the idea of symmetrical difference. So just to recap where we left off last time, we talked about this idea of identity, which focused on the areas of overlap, but then retained the features from the input dataset in the output as well. So you ended up with the areas of overlap, as well as the geometry from the original input, and the attributes from both were copied over with a null value for areas where there was no overlap. Okay? And this idea of the null value is going to be very important when we start talking about this idea of today's video on symmetrical difference. Right, on symmetrical difference. Let's see if I can actually make that difference a little more readable. Right, on symmetrical difference. Symmetrical difference. Okay, right. And so the idea with symmetrical difference is almost the opposite of intersect in many ways. In the idea with symmetrical difference, what you're doing is you're retaining geometry. Spelled retaining wrong. Retaining geometry of those areas where there is no overlap. Right, where there is no overlap. Attributes from both inputs are retained. Right. So basically what we're doing is if we have two inputs, anywhere that they overlap is discarded, and we're going to end up with an output containing the geometry of areas where there were no overlap and the attributes from both inputs. Okay? So once again, let's look at our handy-dandy example of wetlands. I'm going to try and simplify these wetlands a little bit to make it a little bit easier to see what's going on here. Right, so instead of having them be these complex squiggles, we're going to have them be as close to circles as I can make them. And we're going to have our construction sites. Okay. And so again, right, we'll have fen, coastal, marsh, and wooded. Let's try to make that a little bit cleaner. Wooded, and then we'll have Smith, Marshall, Carl, Jones, and Carl. Right. So again, we have our wetlands. Oops. With the attribute type and we have our construction sites. With the attribute owner, right? I've just labeled them. So Smith is the owner of this construction site. Fen is the type of this wetland. Okay? And so let's go ahead and run symmetrical difference, which I'm going to call SD for short, for symmetrical difference. Okay? So what are we going to be looking at? Well, the idea with symmetrical difference, as it was written, right, we retain the geometry of those areas where there is no overlap, right? So put another way, we're going to remove overlap. So let's look at overlap. Well, we have our overlap here, we have overlap here, we have overlap here, 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 and here, right? Okay. So the areas that are not they're areas where there is no overlap. Well, we have this area here, right? There's no overlap, right? Because we cut out the portion of overlap there. So in our output, right, our first new area, it's going to look something like that. So that's going to be 1. And again, I'm just numbering the polygons here. Okay, right? Second, we have this area here. Right? So it's going to extend kind of like this, down. It's going to extend down and around like that. So this would be 2. Right? Now the key thing here with 2 is that there's actually going to be a hole. And I'm going to emphasize that by outlining it in yellow. Right? This yellow area, this is a hole. Oop, this is a hole. Right? There's no data in there. Right? So polygon 1 goes like this. Polygon 2 goes like that. And this piece here is an actual hole. There's no data there. Okay? Make sure that you're clear on that. Okay? So next we have this polygon here that goes up, curves in, and goes down. Right? Because again, this area here, right, that's a hole. There's no data in there either. Okay? So this would be 3. Right? This is what's left of the Marshall construction site without the without the pieces that were cut out. Right? And then we have, so this is 3. I'm going to move over just a little bit, give us a little bit more room to work with here. Okay. So then we're going to go, we're going to finish this circle off here. And then we have something that looks like that. Right? And again, this right here, and this right here, right, those are holes. And I keep pointing that out because it's important to understand that symmetrical difference is cutting out the areas of overlap and removing them. Okay? So what we're left with are the areas that have no overlap. So 4 and 5. Okay? Just go ahead and look at the bottom. So we have, this So original construction site, I'm redrawing the original data set. Ooh, that's a little bit much. I'm redrawing the original data here as best as I can. Right. So this would be 6, right? The area minus the overlap here, right? So just to recap, right, 6 would be this here, right? Because again, right, this area of overlap here, this is a hole, meaning there is no data there. So this is 6, right? 7, 8, 9, 10. And again, any areas where there was overlap is now a hole. Right? There's no data there. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense. This idea that we're putting both outputs, we're putting both inputs in the output, and we're actually removing any areas where they overlap. Okay? So let's then turn our attention to the attribute table. Right? So let's look at 1, 2, 3, and then we'll jump down and we'll look at 8. If I can make 8 look right, look at 8, 9, and 10. Okay. So let's go ahead and think through what's going to happen here. Well, as we said when we set up the definition, right, that the attribute table in this case is going to have the attributes of both the inputs. Move that up just a little bit so that we can put the types, right? And so again, from the wetland data set, right, the green circles, right, we said they have the attribute of type. So type is coming over. And then from the gray construction sites, right, we had the attribute of owner. So type is coming from the wetlands, owner is coming from the construction sites, and then we're going to look at each of the data sets to say, okay, well, what do we pull from? So let's look at 1 first. So 1's geometry, just to sort of reiterate what's going on here, right? I'm going to outline it in brown, right? The geometry of 1 does not include that hole, right? So if we look at 1, does not include the hole. Let me move back up just a little bit so we can see a little bit better. Right? If we look at 1, which does not include the hole, 1 is going to give us an owner of Smith, right? Because this polygon here corresponds to the original construction site owned by Smith minus the overlap with Fenn. So it's going to have an owner type of Smith, or an owner name of Smith, I should say. What about type? Well, again, we're excluding this overlap. This has been removed. So we're only looking at this piece right here. If we look at that, we see that there is no type, right? Because it's not overlapped. So it's actually going to have a type of null. Right? And again, we talked about null when we talked about identity, that null means that there's no data value for that, right? That this particular polygon, right, polygon 1, has no type. Okay? Well, let's look at 2. Right? 2 corresponds to the original Fenn wetland polygon minus the parts that have been overlapped. Okay? So it's going to be pulling its type from fen here. Okay? But for owner, right, well, if we look here, right, there is no owner. So its owner type is going to be null, right? Because again, there is no overlap between construction sites and fens here, or construction sites and wetlands here. So it only has the attribute coming from the original wetland. Okay? So let's look at 3. 3 is going to be the parts of the original construction site minus the overlap. So it's going to pull its attribute from the overlap, from the original construction site. So its owner type is going to be Marshall. But again, just like with the first construction site, there is no attribute for type. So it's going to be null. Right? Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's go ahead and just beat this point home by going through the last 3 here. So we're going to look at 8, 9, and 10. Well, 8, right? 8 corresponds to this original. There's actually overlap there. Right? 8 corresponds to this original construction site minus the overlap with marsh and wooded. So its owner is going to be the owner of that original construction site, Carl, right? For attribute for type, right, again, we're ignoring the overlaps here, so it doesn't have one. So it's going to be null. Okay? Looking at 9, right, 9 again corresponds to this original wooded area. So it's going to have a type for wetland type of wooded. But it's going to have an attribute for owner of null. All right, and the last one, all right, 10 is going to correspond to this original construction site here minus the overlap. So it's going to have an owner type of Jones, and it's going to have an attribute type of null. Right, so hopefully that makes sense. This idea that with symmetrical difference, we're actually removing any areas of overlap. We're keeping the attributes from both, but in the cases where your attributes from the other input data set, you actually get a null, right? Because there's no way that this particular piece of construction site has any wetland type, right? Because there's no overlap, because we've removed the overlaps. So it's going to have an attribute type of null, or attribute for type of null, because there's no type associated with this construction site, only in owner. Hopefully that makes sense. And if you have any questions, as always, please reach out. Thank you.